Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And as Jenna mentioned, welcome to WCAG 2.2. My name is Michaela Lederman. I'm the Senior Accessibility and QA Lead here at Aten Design Group. I am a certified Web Accessibility Specialist through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. And we're obviously going to be talking about all things new with WCAG 2.2. I will be calling it a couple different things, WCAG, WCAG, whatever you want to call it. Just know we're talking about WCAG 2.2. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to leave them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we should have time at the end to address them. So let's dive in. So let's start off with some background. What exactly is WCAG? Well, it stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are the international guidelines for accessibility standards for the internet for desktops, laptops, tablets, and mobile devices. Currently, we're on version 2.2 as of earlier this month. All versions are completely backwards compatible, meaning as long as you're staying up to date with like even 2.1, moving to 2.2 should be pretty easy to move forward with. And WCAG is made up of 13 guidelines, each separated and grouped by the principle of POUR. POUR stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Following this principle as a general rule of thumb when creating digital assets can ensure that your work is both usable and accessible to everyone. And under each of those 13 guidelines, there are multiple testable success criteria which determines conformance. This means that content needs to meet these success criteria to be considered conformant to that guideline. For instance, if one guideline has 4 success criteria, then your website should pass each of the relevant criteria in order to be considered successful and conform to that guideline. And as mentioned, there are 13 guidelines in total, but there are 86 success criteria in total for WCAG 2.2. Each success criteria is marked as one of 3 levels, A, AA, or AAA. A is that bare minimum that everyone should be hitting. All of these are relevant to pretty much every website or a digital asset that you may have, such as providing accurate alternative text for images, for example. AAA is kind of the complete opposite of that. So this is the highest level that you can get to. Not all of them are relevant to your website because a lot of them may be more touch-based or maybe more application-based, more game-based. However, if there is one that's relevant to you should be focusing on that AAA guideline. AA is what we all need to be adhering to. This is kind of that bare minimum that we should all be getting to when we try to get any of those success criteria and the guidelines met. Some guidelines can be reviewed with automated testing tools, but a majority actually follow human logic and actual user testing, and therefore require manual testing. Just remember that there is no one solution for digital accessibility. So let's talk a little bit more about WCAG 2.2. When did the new recommended version of WCAG go into effect? And this is always a fun conversation. This has been going on for quite some time. Originally, it was supposed to be in effect in June of 2021, but as we can all guess, this is obviously come and gone. So then the big next push was the summer of 2022, which again, we missed that deadline. There was more that needed to be fixed up. April 2023, we were all really looking forward to this one. I actually even did a presentation about how excited we were about this becoming live, and unfortunately, that also came and went. And then September 2023, we were told this was our final date. This is when it's going to be happening. And that didn't happen. However, it finally became the recommended version on October 5th of 2023. For once, I was actually very happy with the amount of Google alerts that I had in my inbox. And yes, it did keep getting pushed out, which is a little annoying, but for good reason. WCAG guidelines are put together by an international committee, and these are the guidelines for everyone to follow. So they have to make sure that these new success criteria can be testable without any assumptions or any confusion. And if there is any question, then it stays in this long candidate recommendation stage that we were in for all of that time from June until October, and is revisited and reviewed and updated until it is finalized and makes sense. So now that we have a little bit of background, I think it's time that we jump into all the updates and what's new with this release. WCAG 2.2 has a focus on extending requirements for users with low vision, cognitive impairments, and limited fine motor skills. 4 out of 13 guidelines have been updated. 2 guidelines fall under the operable principle, meaning that all users should be able to operate a website's interface, its components, and its navigation easily. So we have 2 of those here, navigable and input modalities. 2 guidelines fall under the understandable principle, meaning that information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable to all users. And these are under the predictable and input assistance guideline. And don't worry too much about the numbering system you will be seeing throughout this whole presentation. I'm including them here just for reference, but you will not be getting tested on any of these numbers, of course, at the end of this. And unless you are looking to really become a certified accessibility expert, then there is no need to try and memorize these. Now, these 4 guidelines we just talked about now have 9 new success criteria in total. These are all listed here, and we will be doing a deep dive into each one so you can understand a bit more about what's changing. But you can see we have some AAA guidelines or success criteria, AA, some regular A. We even have some minimum and enhanced versions, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail about going forward. And one success criterion was actually removed in this round. Parsing in this context refers to the ability of assistive technology to interpret HTML. However, this success criteria has been deemed obsolete. According to the W3, assistive technology no longer has any need to directly parse HTML, and consequently, these problems no longer exist. Everything happens in the browser itself nowadays, so we don't need the success criteria before, because in the past, the assistive technology and screen reader would actually have to interpret the HTML and change it as needed, including JavaScript. And it was kind of a little bit messy, so now we don't have to worry about it, so it's no longer there. So now that we know a little bit of background, let's jump into more details about each of the new success criterion. And just a warning that there's a lot of information to digest. And honestly, WCAG guidelines and success criteria are not always written in the most user-friendly way, as it can be very technical. I will do my best to explain everything, but of course, if you have any questions or need more help in general, feel free to leave it in the Q&A or the chat, and we can talk about it if we have time at the end with questions, or obviously you can reach out after the presentation if you have more. Our first few additions fall under the guideline navigable. Provide ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. Before we take a look at the success criteria here, I do think it's important for everyone to understand what the focus state is, since 3 of these new it's a mouthful here. Since 3 of the new success criterion are related directly to focus states. When a visual user navigates the site by something other than a mouse, like a keyboard, for instance, we want to make sure that the user understands where they are on the page. Otherwise, they could be interacting with the wrong button or maybe the wrong link, for example. We accomplish this by incorporating a focus state. So let's take a look at what I am referring to. So if we look at this little presentation here with Ames Community College, you can see I'm actually tabbing through with my keyboard, and you can see there's always this little outline over exactly what we're interacting with. And this is all I'm referring to when I talk about that focus state. It's something that you can see no matter where you are. I know exactly which button or link I would be interacting with, and there's no confusion there. So that's what these next success criteria is going to be focusing on. And so now that we understand that a little bit, I do think now we can finally jump into the new guidelines. So the first new additional guide or success criteria is focus not obscured, minimum, and AA criteria. This is a level AA, as I mentioned, which we are all understanding we should be at least doing this, but that minimum part is something that you will be seeing more of. So you'll see a minimum in the enhanced version. This is a great thing to notice, because if you do see this minimum version, then you know that there is a AAA supporting success criteria as well. But of course, as I mentioned, this is that bare minimum that you should be meeting here. So what exactly is this new success criteria? Well, when a user interface component receives keyboard focus, the component is not entirely hidden due to author-created content. Well, it kind of makes sense, but really this is meaning that ensure that when an item gets keyboard focus, it's at least partially visible to the user. And the good thing with all the WCAG criteria and guidelines is that they always include these persona quotes. So if you're ever a little confused, this kind of always helps a little bit to better understand what's happening. And so the problematic quote that you may hear is something like, this page has a big banner that's always across the bottom, like a sticky footer or a cookie banner or something of the sort. When I move focus to items, some are hidden behind the banner and I cannot fully see them. And we obviously want to hear something like, when I move focus to items, I can see them all. That would be the ideal scenario. So who does this update actually benefit? Well, this includes people with low vision and or mobility impairments who may rely on a keyboard or keyboard interface component, including speech inputs, sip and puff software, on-screen keyboards, scanning software, and a variety of other assistive technology and alternate keyboards, as well as people with attention limitations, short-term memory limitations, and so on. And of course, all of these guidelines and success criteria are going to help all users who are interacting with the site as well. So it's a little bit of background. Let's jump into a couple examples so we can see it in action. So as you can see here, I'm using AIMS here as an example again. I actually played around with this so that we can use these as an example. Just know that this actually works very well on their site. But here we have the example of, I have the student life mega menu open. So we have that open, but I'm also tabbing through. And if you look carefully, you can actually see that in the breadcrumbs, clubs and organizations is what that text is. That has the focus state right now. You can see it's partially hidden by that drop down. However, you can see a majority of it. So this technically passes. However, if we go to this other example here, I have this drop down menu open. And if you get really close to your screen and you have somehow like a good quality Zoom video going on, you may be able to see that there is some text in that first paragraph that has a focus state around it. Probably can't see it, and that's totally fine. That's the point of this presentation and this example, that this one wouldn't pass because you cannot see it. It's hidden by the content. So basically, we just need to make sure that we're seeing at least part of the link or interactive item that we're trying to play with. Overall, if it's not in focus, it needs to be in focus and at least partially visible. So this one is the more enhanced version of the focus not obscured that we just talked about. And as mentioned, this is the enhanced and there's AAA. So now we're having that higher version that we're looking at. I'm not going to go into the personas or anything like that, but we can talk about the difference between the two. So what really is the biggest difference there? Well, as we know from the AA version, we're basically focusing on having it not entirely hidden, that focus element, when in reality with the AAA, we need to make sure that no part of the component at all is hidden. So unlike the AA and AAA, it says that nothing can be hidden by the element at all. Therefore, ensure that when an item gets keyboard focus, it is fully visible to the user. So if we look at those examples again, in this instance where we have clubs and organizations that's partially hidden over here, this would not pass for AAA. Ideally, we would maybe want, as soon as there's no focus in this dropdown, that dropdown would disappear and go back to normal. And so there would be nothing in the way so that we wouldn't ever encounter that. That would be the ideal solution for what's going on. And of course, as we know, this failed for AA, so of course it's going to fail for the AAA. And focus appearance, this AAA version here, is closely related to another criteria that's already in WCAG called focus visible. Focus visible requires that a visible focus indicator exists while a component has keyboard focus. So it has that little outline that we were talking about before. However, focus appearance defines the minimum level of visibility and just how it's going to appear in general. So this one is a complete mouthful. So you're going to have to bear with me for a minute because I do want to read it actually off the screen so that we can kind of dive into a couple of these things. So when the keyboard focus indicator is visible, an area of the focus indicator meets all of the following criteria. It is at least as large as the area of 2 CSS pixel thick perimeter of the unfocused components or subcomponent, and it has a contrast ratio of at least 3:1 between the same pixels in the focused and unfocused states. Basically, just make it easier to spot the keyboard focus using a focus indicator of sufficient size and contrast. And that 3:1 ratio is very common for contrast throughout design and WCAG in general. So make sure you're following that with your focus appearance as well. There are a couple exceptions here. So of course, if the focus indicator is determined by the user agent or the browser, and it cannot be adjusted by the author, so for instance, the browser default, then you're fine here. or if the focus indicator and the indicator background color are not modified by the author, because again, it is the browser or the user agent default. So of course, I do want to talk about the notes and exceptions. Basically, there was a lot to understand there, but the general rule of thumb and something I'm always saying to do is when it comes to focus states, just stick with the browser defaults. This then relies just on the browser and the native elements and gives users who rely on keyboard focus to navigate the ability to actually update their focus to whatever works best for them in those scenarios. So if you leave it at the browser default, some of them might have extensions that can actually change that outline, so it's something that works best for them. If you start changing it, then you may override some of the pieces that they're looking for, so stick with the browser default and you will be fine here. So a great problematic quote that you may hear is something like, I can't tell where the keyboard focus is as I move around a web page or an app, and this could be because of contrast or because it's not thick enough. So who does this update actually benefit? Well, this benefits the same users from those first two focus, not obscured criteria as we went over originally. That's because all the focus criteria rely on each other for an overall great experience. So let's jump into a couple examples. So this one, very simple. I mean, you can tell exactly which one's in focus because we have a simple outline. This was actually a screenshot from Firefox a few months ago, but as I saw the other day, they actually updated their default to actually be more consistent with how Chrome and Safari make it look with like that bluish color. So this is a little different, but of course this still passes because it has that high contrast and you know exactly what's going on. You may see instances like this where people get a little more creative with their outlines that they're viewing, where it's actually just an outline of the exact SVG of what's going on here. So you can see it looks like the star. And of course, this technically passes. However, that's a little bit more work. So what we tend to see is something more like this, where it's just that box that surrounds everything. And this, of course, works well in that instance and is high contrast. It's thick. You can see exactly where it is. Another way of achieving this that it mentions in the success criteria is contrast focus requirement, and that's to alter the appearance of the entire component like this by changing its color to that 3:1 ratio. This can be effective in a set of closely placed buttons like this because, of course, you can see that we're focused on here. We can see the difference between all of them, and so that technically works. However, it is much more difficult to detect such a focus indicator when components are not near each other. So let's say you had a button on the left side of the screen and the right side of the screen, that they look the same, but you can't really tell which one's which because the focus indicators aren't next to each other or the buttons aren't next to each other. So you can't really do a compare and contrast very easily. And this could be an issue for users with magnification tools who may not be able to easily compare components that are next to each other like this because they're zoomed in so much with the magnification that it's harder to compare the two. It's also tough too that you've probably seen in instances, maybe you have tabs on your screen, but you only have two tabs and one is active and one isn't. And it's kind of that same sense that like, which one is actually the active state? Because now I don't really know what the consistent pattern is. So when in doubt, I definitely always say to use the browser default because this can get a little confusing. And because we went over those requirements, one of them actually talks about a little wordy piece there that said, is at least as large as the area of a 2 CSS pixel thick perimeter of the unfocused component, which sounds a little wild, but it's meaning you can do some kind of math to do some confirmation that other focus states pass, like technically this one here, because the area of the focus state, those yellow bars, is equal to whatever the area of the focus state would be if we went, it's a whole thing. Really, if you need to use any kind of complex mathematics to work out if a focus indicator is large enough, it's probably a sign that you should be using a larger indicator in general or just a simpler one. But of course, using the browser default is always my suggested direction as it automatically passes with no hesitation. And now we're on to a new guideline, input modalities. We have two success criteria that fall under this. So what it's saying is that we want to make it easier for users to operate functionality through various inputs beyond just keyboard. So this big one here is dragging movements, and this is AA. So if you do have any drag and drop, it is going to be something that you need to comply to on your website. So what is this new success criterion? Well, all functionality that uses a dragging movement for operation can be achieved by a single pointer without dragging. unless, of course, the dragging is essential or the functionality is determined by the user agent and not modified by the author. So basically, it means that don't rely on dragging for any users at all. And for any action that does involve dragging and dropping, provide a simple alternative as well with just a simple pointer, a touch, or a text box. And you may have seen here that it does have the exception with it being essential, but there are very few exceptions that may fall under this dragging being essential. One of the only times I can really think of that this may be included is for, let's say, it's a learning activity that is focused on dexterity, and dragging and dropping is the ultimate goal of the game. But that wouldn't account for many other scenarios on the web because you should be able to probably interact with it in some other way. But that game is trying to make, I don't know, a 3-year-old learn how to drag something from one side of the screen to the other without hitting any obstacles in the way. And it's kind of just focusing on that overall mobility piece there. So a problematic quote that we may hear is something like, I cannot hold down the mouse button and drag it accurately enough to move the items in this list. What we want to hear is something like, when I click on an item in the list, I get up and down arrows and I can click those to actually change the order. And who does this update benefit? Well, it benefits users who struggle with performing dragging movement and fine motor control, because dragging in the drop functionality can actually be very difficult. When an interface implements drag and drop functionality, users actually perform 4 discrete actions. You first have to tap or click to establish the starting point. Then you press and hold it while also performing a repositioning of your hand or the pointer before you then have to release it. So really, there's a lot of things going on, and this can be very difficult for many people with that control. However, even think about using a trackpad. I don't know if you've ever had to use a drag and drop, and then you get to your end of your trackpad and you're like, oh no, how do I keep doing this? I can't move anything. And if I move my hand off of the trackpad, it's going to go back to the starting position, and it's a whole thing. So basically what we're trying to do is avoid that. So there are so many different types of examples when it comes to drag and drop out there, but hopefully these next few will give you an idea of what I'm talking about and some possible solutions to those issues. One of the biggest things I'm definitely going to be seeing everywhere is probably the use of maps. A map allows users to drag the view of the map around, and in order to make this more usable to everyone, the map should have probably up and down and left to right buttons to move the view as well. Currently, for example, this one has a keyboard shortcut button. If you probably can't see it very well here, but Google Maps always has this keyboard shortcut. You can easily find it if you're using your keyboard, but you can also click on it down at the bottom, and that's great. So if you can't use the drag and drop, you can use your keyboard. But what about if you're on your phone or a tablet or some other touch device? You don't have that keyboard to interact with it. So now what is the option that you need to do? So if you zoom in, that's fine, but what if you need to zoom in and also go to the left? So there's the whole thing that we need to implement something else to make that a little bit easier. I will say that this probably is up to Google to fix and not necessarily you, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And technically the keyboard shortcut could work because you could click on that on your iPhone. However, it's not going to be a great experience in general. So like that's definitely going to have to be updated. But overall, like I said, unless you have a custom version, then I wouldn't worry too much about it until Google updates that. But here you can see is another great example. This is actually the admin side from Drupal. So as you can see in the left column where underneath field, you have all the different fields that you can be working with, but you also have that drag and drop icon. So you can obviously drag that, move it around to the order that you're looking for. But Drupal, for years, this has been implemented for a very long time, where you have show row weights. So if you were to click on that, it actually gives you the ability to move everything to a different weight and to a different order just by changing the number that's there. So obviously, if it's all zeros, it's going to be higher than the ones, and twos are less than the ones, and so on and so on. So you can easily kind of reorder everything in that way, which is a nice alternative to what you could do. And then even something as simple as a basic slider input will need more options to make accessible. And I know a lot of people might put these slider inputs if you have a form that requires putting in a range instead of using like radios or checkboxes or even text box. A lot of people like this because it does kind of break up all those monotonous inputs and just like those basic fields. However, of course, if you have this, you have to be able to do this a different way as well. So this first one at the top with the foreground and background color, This one has the slider, but you also can just click on the text box and input the hex number that you're looking for the color. And it also has that eyedropper tool so you can change the color. So really you can kind of play around with that, but ideally you would probably have maybe a minus and a plus button there as well, so you can lighten it or darken it very easily without any issues. And then of course the bottom one is another simple example that maybe you have to put in a value or a range. By just having that a text box or even putting in that plus and minus button is a great way to resolve that. This one I know will make at least the designers happy. Originally, the target size minimum needed to be at least 44 pixels by 44 pixels to pass, which can be kind of large from a design standpoint. But with WCAG 2.2, the new minimum is actually 24 by 24 pixels. There are some exceptions to this 24 by 24 pixel rule, but these are more in reference to common sense things like maybe having an equivalent way to achieve the action as well. So maybe the link is small, but on further down on the page, there's actually a big CTA that's having you do that same thing. Or maybe it's like smaller social buttons, but those same social buttons are really large further down on the page. So you have that alternative way. Or maybe it's a text link within a body of text. So that one, obviously, you can't make that be exactly 24 pixels if your line height is not that high, because it's going to ruin the design. So that one makes sense because the area still is going to be a lot larger to deal with. And of course, if it is a browser or user agent default, for example, because if it's always a browser default, then that's perfectly fine. So a problematic quote we may hear is something like, the buttons are so close together, I hit cancel when going for submit. Now I have to start all over again. And of course, we just want to avoid that altogether. So who does this actually update? It benefits users who struggle confidently with targeting or operating small controls and fine motor skills. So this could be anyone using a touch device, disability or not. It could be people using devices in environments where they're exposed to shaking, such as public transportation. It could be mouse users who have difficulty with fine motor movements. It could be people who access a device using just one hand, or people with large fingers or who are operating the device with only part of their finger or their knuckle. This is something that can benefit every single one of us. And I could go over a ton of examples of this with each and every scenario and exception, but I think we can get a gist of it just from the couple I have here. So the point of this really is because the overall goal with target areas, we want to create less of a chance of error when interacting with any element on the site. The larger the target area, the less chance for error. So if we're looking at this, of course, you can see on the left-hand column, just by having that arrow be the clickable area, the target area is a little more difficult than making the entire text area as well. Or as we know that a radio button isn't really great if you're interacting with just that, and that's why labels are always clickable as well. So the larger the clickable area, the greater chance of submission and making sure everything's working correctly. And of course, we want to avoid situations like this, where there are so many interactive buttons in line. I could go try and hit maybe the share button and accidentally start replaying or whatever that icon is conveying. Or what could be even worse is maybe I'm going to add a new note and then I accidentally delete the current item instead. So of course, if you can, always simplify what you have and make sure the target area is large enough. The following illustration is from WCAG here, so you can see kind of the different options of what's going on. That 44 by 44 pixel, that first line is that AAA success criteria. And as you can see here, it isn't necessarily that the icon is 44 by 44 pixels, but the entire target area is. But overall, this first one passes from the AA and AAA standpoint. This next one is always my recommended version, where it's 24 by 24 pixels. It is the icon plus the padding of the target area as well. So there is no confusion. You know exactly how tall that is in general. That one obviously passes. Another great way that you could do it is have the target area be 20 by 20, but then also have the spacing around it included in that. So like having margin at 4 pixels. But overall, that starts getting a little funky. So I would just say stick with that second line and you're more than happy with the passing there. And of course, if it's smaller than 24 by 24, it's not going to pass. So making sure you're sticking with that 24 by 24 pixel and you should be good there. Our next success criteria falls under the guideline predictable, where we want to make web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. This one is regarding consistent help. And as you can see, it's just an A guideline, so everyone should be doing this. Consistency in design is important to an accessible user experience to begin with. Working with the right people and educating yourself on best practices will ensure that location, text, and appearance are all consistent to avoid any confusion. So talking about consistent help will be no different. We want to just make sure that it's consistent and easy and intuitive to find for everybody. So what is this new success criterion? Well, this one is a mouthful. I'm not even going to bother trying to read it out loud, but if you have any way to contact your organization for help, then the link or chatbot or whatever you may have must be found unchanged on every page of your site in the same location, using the same colors, the same text, the same size, and so on. And just for reference, what is considered a chat mechanism, which if you actually did read this, you may have seen that in there. It could be something like human contact details, such as a phone number, email address, hours of operation. It could be human contact mechanism, as I mentioned, such as messaging system, a chat client, a contact form, or a social media channel. It could be a self-help option, such as an up-to-date frequently asked questions page, or like a how do I do this page, or a support page. Or it could be a fully automated contact mechanism, such as a chatbot. This one, in general, I feel like shouldn't be a huge change for you, as consistency, as I mentioned, is important to design and usability already. So if you have any of these on your site and you're having them professionally designed, then this is probably already in place. But a problematic quote that we may hear is something like, whenever I use this online app to schedule my medical appointments, I can't remember what to do at each step. I've seen a chat options in some places or some pages, but I can't find it now. And of course, we want to hear something like, when I need help, I can easily find the chat option that's always in the lower right-hand corner of the page. So who does this benefit? Well, it benefits users with cognitive and learning disabilities. And of course, it benefits everyone using your site. So let's look at a couple examples here. Of course, keeping it nice and simple like this, you can see in that top right side or top right utility nav here, we have About Us, Contact Us, and News. Contact Us is always there. You always know where it is. It's always in that same section of the page. You can easily find it no matter what. This technically satisfies that requirement. Or maybe you have a bunch of different organizations throughout your site and there's different contact information for each one. For AIMS, they always have the contact info in the right sidebar in the first thing that's up there, so that no matter what organization or club you go to, you can always find that contact information. And then, of course, if you have a self-help or a chat option, for instance, it's usually found in the lower right-hand corner like this one. This is perfectly fine as long as it's found on every page in the same spot of every page. So, of course, you can easily get to that help if you need to. And now our final 3 success criteria fall under input assistance, where we want to help users avoid and correct mistakes. This first one is redundant entry. This one is another mouthful, so I'm just going to kind of let it play as I tell you what's going on here. So this one, basically, if you are filling out a form and there are multiple of the same inputs, like maybe your name is on there a few times, or maybe your billing and your shipping address are the same, for example, then a user should not be required to fill this out again, except when like something or someone was doing a true memory game online for fun, for example. So re-entering the information is essential. You have to make sure your memory is correct. That's the point of the game. Or maybe you're retyping a password to ensure that the new password is updated. Or maybe you're just checking to make sure that previously entered information is no longer valid or it's not working anymore. You need to make sure that you're inputting it there. And so a quote that we may hear that could be problematic is, whenever I use the online app to schedule my medical appointments, I have to retype some of the information that I entered in a previous step. And of course, we would prefer to hear something like, the app automatically fills in information that I entered in the previous steps. So who does this update benefit? Well, it could be users with cognitive impairments who experience short-term memory difficulties and not having to repeatedly remember particular information, which reduces stress and the likelihood of mistakes. It could be users who experience difficulty forming new memories, recalling information, and other functions related to cognition that can complete processes without having to unnecessarily rely on their memory, as well as users with mobility impairments. For example, who are using switch control or voice input, they can benefit from a reduced need for text entry because it is not the easiest of assistive technology to use. And of course, this helps everyone because we have a lot of passwords to remember out there. And so I'm sure we've all come across many of these different options and become frustrated. There's nothing worse than typing in your password, saying forgot password. You put a new password in that says cannot use the same password that you've already used. It's a very frustrating experience. We want to make sure that we're avoiding something like that. So of course, something as just including a checkbox like this that we see on many sites satisfies this requirement that it will now input all that same information so you don't have to do it. And of course, if you maybe are doing a multi-page form and your name is required on multiple of them, maybe if your name is just automatically input on each one of those inputs so that you don't have to redo it again. Or you could just use the checkbox, but either one of those are perfectly fine. Next is accessible authentication minimum. So as you know, we're also going to talk about the enhanced version as well. So what is this new success criterion? Well, a cognitive function test, such as remembering a password or solving a puzzle, is not required for any step in an authentication process unless that step provides at least one of the following. I think I gave an example for this one and the last one. I think my mind was already jumping ahead. I was apparently excited about it, so I apologize for that. It must have an alternative method, such as another authentication method that does not rely on cognitive function tests, like maybe a forgot password link. It could be something like a mechanism is available to assist the user in completing the cognitive function test, like setting up a single sign-on or a user flow for multiple apps. It could be something like cognitive function tests, like a CAPTCHA to recognize objects, like how many of these pictures have fire hydrants? Or it could be something where the test is to identify non-text content, like maybe an image that the user provided to the website when you first created the account. So now every time you go to log in to whatever that account is, you can make sure it's you because it's the actual picture that you included, whether it's a soccer ball, a picture of yourself, a dog, or anything of that sort. And note that object recognition for both object recognition and the personal content may be represented by images, video, or audio. A problematic quote that we may hear is something like, I can never remember my password. It's really hard to get into this app. But we want to hear something like, to get into this app, I can put my email address. Then I get an email message and I can click a link into the email to get into the app. So who does this actually benefit? Well, it could be users with cognitive impairments relating to memory, reading, numbers, or perception processing. And like I mentioned in the last success criterion, because I don't know why I said it there, I apologize, but it's going to benefit everyone because we do have a lot of passwords to remember. We have a lot going on there. So just by making this easier for everyone, it's going to make the overall process a little bit easier. So some examples that we may see here is something as simple as having a reset your password or a forgot your password link. It technically satisfies this because you could technically reset your password every single time that you log in. You get sent to your email, you can set it there, move on and sign in and never have to remember a password. Also, having the browser remember your password technically satisfies this criteria as well, since it's automatically inputting the username and password in the correct fields. However, that one's completely up to the user, so you cannot rely on that to satisfy the requirement. So you need at least this reset or forgot your password link. Another one that satisfies this is that need for two-factor authentication or QR codes or device recognition and things of this sort, where maybe you sign into your iPad and then codes get sent to your iPhone, and now you just have to input that same code. So there's no remembering going on. You can easily get that information. Or maybe it's a link that always gets sent to your phone or your email that you can click and you're automatically signed in. And of course, like I mentioned, using images, audio, and video clips all satisfy this criteria as well, like in this CAPTCHA option, which can be okay as long as they are straightforward and not using any kind of a puzzle. But as we all know, I don't know about you guys, but I at least get very frustrated with these ones because there's some instances, I don't know if you can see my mouse at the moment, but there's one of these that has a teeny tiny bit of that traffic light in there. So like, does that count? Does that not count? It can be a frustrating experience. So trying to make this as simple as possible is obviously the best. And this one will never work. Don't ever try to get creative by doing something like this. This is actually taken from a real website from a while ago. I don't actually remember what it was. Thank goodness. I hope that it's not there anymore. But basically, you're making someone place an X in there to make a row of 3. And that may seem very intuitive to you. However, there may be some people who don't quite understand what's happening. Maybe it's difficult to interact with. Maybe it's not usable for assistive technology. So we want to make sure that it's as simple as possible, and this would not satisfy that requirement. And finally, we have the more enhanced version of the accessible authentication, not obscured, we just learned about. Because of that, like I did before, I'm not going to go into the personas, but more talk about the difference between the two. Well, this is basically an exact copy of what we saw in the AA version. However, there is a big difference, and that's that there are no exceptions to this AAA level for images and videos and audio. Any required step of the authentication process cannot display a selection of images, videos, or audio clips to gain access in any way. And it must be completed with only those first 2 bullet points. So if we look at those examples that we talked about before, this one technically still passes because there's no images, there's no audio, there's no videos, nothing to worry about. It's still very straightforward. You can click on the reset your password, get that link, and sign in from there. And of course, this still passes as well. Any of these easier ones with the links or the numbers that get sent your way or QR code and so on. However, CAPTCHAs like this no longer pass. So this would not adhere to that AAA success criteria. And well, that's all that we have for WCAG 2.2. To refresh your memory, here's a list of the 9 success criteria that we went over today in detail. I know that there was a lot that we went over today, but I hope that this helped in understanding what has been updated and what to expect for your digital compliance going forward. And before we end this webinar, I do know we have a number of Colorado agencies and organizations on this call, so I do think it's important to talk about House Bill 211110. That's a mouthful. But for those that don't know, Colorado will be the first state in the country to require and enforce by law that state and local public entities meet website accessibility standards. And I know some of you are probably like, wait, isn't this already a law with the government and the Rehabilitation Act and ADA and all of that stuff? And yes, technically, but it's not really very well enforced. There are no exact, like, this is what's going to happen if you are not actually following those rules, and so on and so on. So right now, Colorado is really making sure that it is enforced, and there will be complete issues, and you will be fined and things of that sort. And there's an outline of what will happen if you do not comply by the certain timeline. And this could apply to many of you today. And if it doesn't, I do think that this law is showing the direction that ADA compliance is going in. So it is important to get ahead of the game. Like, I do know that I'm currently in Massachusetts, and I know that Massachusetts has finally gotten together a committee to kind of figure out this similar kind of law and how to enforce it. So this is definitely going in that direction. For those that need to be aware of that Colorado House bill and what this means for the latest WCAG updates, as of right now, the House bill dictates that the Colorado state agency websites must meet the requirements for WCAG 2.1 level AA conformance. However, this may change over time. The bill does allow that the Governor's Office of Information Technology to adopt new standards as they become necessary. And because WCAG 2.2 was very recently released, these requirements may eventually change prior to that July 1st deadline to reflect W3C's latest recommendation. However, as I looked this morning, there has been no update for final direction, but I do imagine that this will change, or they'll at least put some kind of verbiage in there to talk about the 2.2. So if you're thinking about what your options are, because now you're worried about what to do about 2.2, really there's 2 different options. It's encouraged to prepare for that change by either complying to those standards by the deadline, just pretty straightforward, or by creating a plan of action to incorporate these updates in the near future. So if you do this, I highly recommend including more information about it in your accessibility statement. But in short, even if it can't be implemented prior to the deadline, a plan and timeline should at least be discussed and put into place to ensure that conformance is completed soon after the deadline at least. And remember, of course, related to WCAG, related to accessibility, related to HB 21, and so on and so on. Aten is always here to help. I'm here to help with whatever you need. We believe in giving back to the community, like doing informative webinars like the one I'm doing today, as well as free consultations, which you can sign up for by going to the website. And I have also included a number of webinars that may be relevant to you and your team in regards to digital accessibility. And Jenna will send out a bunch of resources after the fact as well to help you on your accessibility journey.